What are your prime directives?
Serve the public trust, protect the innocent, uphold the law.
That's good. That's very good. Huh? Huh?
Of all the directors in the last few decades, Paul Verhoeven gets frequently praised as the most prophetic. Like all great prophets, from Nostradamus to The Simpsons, this must get chalked up to a bunch of different factors, from purely coincidental to an almost mystical ability to be plugged into the cultural zeitgeist. After working at home in the Netherlands for a couple decades, Verhoeven made an international name for himself in the late 1970s. Paul Verhoeven's early work is all in Dutch, and during this first phase, the Seattle Times praised Verhoeven as a one-man Dutch movie industry. However, like in many countries, Dutch films are subsidized by the government, which makes it hard to create controversial work. And Verhoeven has always reveled in the controversial. In the 1980s, Verhoeven decided to move to the United States to get studio financing for his next few movies. However, this meant switching to English language filmmaking. Starting with an ambitious project, Verhoeven co-wrote an ambitious historical drama with his longtime screenwriting collaborator called Flesh and Blood, with an international cast that turned into a disastrous and complicated process. Flesh and Blood was pulled in multiple directions by the creative team, censored for a controversial rape scene, and disastrous at the box office. However, Verhoeven chose an interesting decade to move to the United States, one where money was flooding into corporate coffers, and I think it's safe to say creativity was often lacking. The Universal Pictures story executive, who dreamed of becoming a screenwriter, Edward Neumeier, had conceived of this basic idea for Robocop after witnessing Blade Runner get filmed in the creative lot behind his office. Neumeier teamed up with an aspiring director named Michael Miner, who had sent a music video into Universal.
Sure, but I think that we have to thank really the two writers, Michael Miner and at Neumeier, who basically presented a lot of these things already in the script. I mean, I came to the United States was 85, 86, and yeah, I jumped into this movie, but I was not so much aware of the political situations that were around. So I'm very. I'm absolutely sure that none of these political observations were coming from me.
Verhoeven also had a connection to Blade Runner, as the Dutch actor Rutger Hauer, who played the villain Roy, had been the star of Flesh and Blood. Neumeier shopped around Hollywood for a buyer for Robocop, eventually ending up at Orion Pictures. Orion Pictures was where Verhoeven had found the financing for Flesh and Blood. However, Verhoeven was not the first director slated to direct. That was Jonathan Kaplan, who ended up leaving to direct Project X.
To the break of dawn, yo!
No, not that one. The Matthew Broderick one. After Kaplan dropped out, Orion suggested Verhoeven as the director to take over. Verhoeven initially declined the script, and it took 3 sets of rewrites to get him to agree to it. The Blade Runner and Orion connection seemed like perhaps they were the coincidences that aligned the stars for Robocop. Neumeier tapped into the cultural zeitgeist, as he would teach Verhoeven to do for their next, even more prophetic collaboration, Starship Troopers.
Having been a child during World War II and being occupied by the Germans in the 40s in Holland, I mean, I recognized a lot of stuff, and in some way, but although differently. So, but I mean, it's really at Neumeier and Michael Miner who set up this kind of political level that the movie has.
The 1980s were the era of Reagan and Bush, the corporatization of business merging with the hand of state power. And first Carter, then Reagan, ushered in an unprecedented privatization of the public sector.
It is for this reason that I must tell those who fail to report for duty this morning they are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
Starting with Nixon in the 1970s, the war on drugs had led to an increase in incarceration, as well as the ballooning of police budgets across the country.
If we're going to have a successful offensive, we need more money. Consequently, I'm asking the Congress for $155 million in new funds, which will bring the total amount this year in the budget for drug abuse, both in enforcement and treatment to over $350 million.
This moved in tandem with deindustrialization, hitting urban centers in the Midwest and causing poverty and thus crime to skyrocket in cities which had flourished just decades earlier.
It is no exaggeration to say that many people are afraid to be out on the streets at night. Detroiters know about their own city's reputation.
Anyway, she pled guilty to manslaughter.
The homicide rate has gone up during good times and bad, when there was racial tension and when there was not, when other crimes increased or decreased. Homicide is a growth industry. In 10 years, the homicide toll increased 5.5 times.
No better city to exemplify those problems than Detroit, where Robocop is set. In its heyday right after World War II, Detroit was a flourishing city that was the center of auto manufacturing in the United States. The big three automakers, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, are still headed in Michigan.
Foundrymen, blacksmiths, marine engineers, and carriage builders easily switched over to car building. Then, when they figured out a system of fabricating the parts and putting autos together on a moving conveyor, it set the pattern for mass production, the mass production of all sorts of wonderful products. It fired the starting gun for today and the greater days that lie ahead.
But by the late 1960s, as Japan and Germany recovered economically, they began importing cars. The big three began moving their manufacturing to right-to-work states to avoid the demands of United Auto Workers. Detroit was hollowed out and began shrinking. Also, much like other flourishing cities, as the white unionized middle class made more money, they moved out to the suburbs.
As in many other cities, the central business district is not what it used to be. Some people describe it harshly as a zone of decay. At any rate, business has declined, with much of the commerce fleeing to the suburbs.
Meanwhile, a southern exodus pushed more African Americans and Latino Americans into cities like Detroit. Deindustrialization in the 1970s meant poverty for minority communities that had recently moved to Detroit. This makes Detroit, a hollowed out and shrinking city, the perfect setting for Robocop. In Robocop, Detroit has fallen so far that it's a complete dystopia on the brink of full collapse. The mega corporation, Omni Consumer Products, has purchased the city of Old Detroit in order to create the first privatized city, Delta City, as a giant company town. To clean up Detroit in order to move their construction workers, presumably the first wave of residents, into the city, they privatized the Detroit Police Department.
3 dead police officers, 1 critically injured. Police union leaders blame Omni Consumer Products, OCP, the firm which recently entered into a contract with the city to fund and run the Detroit Metropolitan Police Department. Dick Jones, Division President, OCP.
Every policeman knows when he joins the force that there are certain inherent risks that come with the territory.
To clean up the city, Vice President Dick Jones,
I work for Dick Jones! Dick Jones!
commissions the ED-209, Enforcement Droid Series 209, which has been contracted by the military, but malfunctions and kills an Omni executive. Don't worry, it's just a junior executive. Not wanting to lose the contract or get the bad PR, the old man, Omni's CEO, allows a junior executive named Bob Morton to pitch the Robocop project. Verhoeven and Neumeier have explained they visualized Robocop as a Jesus figure for the Reagan era. Reagan Jesus.
I'm afraid I can't comment on Delta City. That's not my division. But I will tell you this. At Security Concepts, we're projecting the end of crime in Old Detroit within 40 days.
After trying to bring in several big actors, Orion greenlit the casting of Peter Weller as Robocop. Verhoeven said he liked Weller's chin, the only part exposed by the Robocop suit.
So we basically cast it partially on Jaws here. Peter Weller has really the good Jaws, you know. So
Robocop is the perfect corporate soldier, requiring barely any food and no sleep, mostly made of metal armor.
His digestive system is extremely simple. This processor dispenses a rudimentary paste that sustains his organic system.
Robocop has no memories and is programmed for 4 directives: serve the public trust, protect the innocent, uphold the law, and a secret 4th thing. Detroit is overrun by a gang led by Clarence Boddicker, played by Kurtwood Smith.
Or you can hop out of here with my boot in your ass!
At the top of the pyramid is Dick Jones. Dick Jones, Omni's vice president, who's trying to profit off all the misery while also having the company in charge of both fighting crime and military contracts. This shows the immoral nature of corporations in general. Robocop was way ahead of its time, tackling huge issues like police militarization and privatization that would plague our society for the next half-century. Long live Reagan Jesus.
You cocksucker! I work for Dick Jones! Dick Jones! He's the number 2 guy at OCP! OCP runs the cops! You're a cop!